So I'm going to begin recording now.
Okay, it is after two, excuse me.
Okay, so let's just begin. Um,
Okay, we shall begin. So, on behalf of the Bordentown Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. We are located in historic Bordentown, New Jersey. My name is Steve Letterman. I am the co-president of the Bordentown Historical Society. The other co-president is my better half, Bonnie Goldman, whom you will meet shortly. This lecture is the first of a four-part lecture series organized by the BHS in celebration of and honoring Clara Barton on her 200th birthday this year. We are also celebrating Women's History Month by honoring Clara. We are fortunate to have as our presenter Dr. Marion Moser Jones. Dr. Jones is an associate professor and graduate director in the Department of Family Science at the University of Maryland School of Public Health in College Park, Maryland. Her research examines the institutionalization, I practiced that about 5 times, of benevolence in the United States through an historical and ethical lens. She is the author of the book, The American Red Cross from Clara Barton to the New Deal, and that is a really great book, as well as numerous peer-reviewed articles that place maternal and child health, homelessness, and other topics in historical, ethical, and social context. Dr. Jones was a 2010-2011 DeWitt Stenton postdoctoral fellow at the National Institutes of Health. She received her PhD and MPH degrees in socio-medical sciences from Columbia University and her AB degree from Harvard College. So without further ado, I am pleased and excited to introduce Dr. Marion Moser Jones. Dr. Jones, believe it or not, is joined by none other than the incredible Clara Barton, who needs no introduction. So Dr. Jones.
well, Stephen, Dr. Letterman, thank you so much for having me, and I am just stunned to finally get to meet Clara Barton. I have, needless to say, read quite a bit about you. And Miss Barton, it's such an honor to meet you on this momentous occasion celebrating your 200th.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Moser Jones. First of all, for writing a book referring to me, Red Cross. But I do have to tell you that at this moment, I am only 199 years old, not to turn 200 until Christmas Day.
Well, you look great for 199, I have to say.
Why, thank you. But it's been a very challenging year. This past year has been challenging with regard to a couple of issues. One, weight control, and the other, hair color issues. I may not be the only one who has felt those challenges.
Yes, I know, Clara. Oh, if I may, Clara, I'm sorry, Miss
Oh,
Barton.
yes. Yes.
The pandemic has really been hard on all of us. I sometimes feel like I might be 199 after the challenges with being a working mother and just, being stuck in the house, et cetera. So, but beyond that, it's just great to have this rare opportunity to meet a true American icon such as yourself. And so I'm really dying to ask you, what do you think is your biggest, most lasting accomplishment?
Well, I have to say that although I was very proud of my service as a nurse on the front lines of the Civil War in 9 battles, as a matter of fact, and my efforts to locate missing soldiers after the Civil War, and we were able to locate 22,000 missing soldiers, of course, many of whom had passed away. I have to say that my most lasting accomplishment may well be the fact that I had urged President Chester Arthur to sign the Treaty of Geneva, which of course helped with the care and treatment of wounded soldiers and aid workers, and also the founding of the American Red Cross in 1881, where we focused on disaster relief.
Yes, those were tremendous, tremendous accomplishments. And I'd also like to ask you, I mean, you had such an amazing career, an amazing life. What's your biggest regret?
I think my biggest regret is simply that I did suffer some significant bouts of ill health during the course of my life, and even bouts of depression. Um, and it was during those times that I was unable to help others, and I found that to be very frustrating and challenging.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being so open about your struggles. Certainly, that's one reason I really admire you is that despite the fact that you struggled with your ill health and what now we'd call depression, you managed to somehow persist and bounce back and continue your work. And that's just amazing and very inspiring, I have to say, to me.
Well, thank you.
Um, so finally, so we are here. I understand you've come back to Bordentown, New Jersey, for the celebration, and maybe you can bring us back to, what happened in 1852 when you came to Bordentown, and got involved in education.
Well, I actually had met a friend in 1850. I went to get some further education myself in New York State, and I met a friend named Mary Norton. And my mother passed away at that time, and I was in Hightstown, New Jersey, which is nearby, for
Mhm.
7 months. But it was very challenging living with the Norton family. So I also decided I needed a little more privacy
Mm,
and independence. So I moved to Bordentown, New Jersey, and I was in a boarding house. But I was quite shocked to see that there were many, many school aged boys on the streets,
mm.
and they seemed to be wandering around aimlessly. They were smoking tobacco, and I asked them why they weren't in school. And they told me that they weren't in school because they couldn't afford to be in a school. Their family couldn't afford school. And of course, I was quite surprised about that because in Massachusetts, where I grew up, we had public schools. They were successful, they were accepted by folks. But in New Jersey, the public school was considered a pauper school. And so people were not really interested or excited about public schools. But I was a dyed in the wool teacher. And when I got to Bordentown, realizing there was no public school and that public schools in New Jersey didn't exist, I offered to teach for nothing if they would give me a schoolhouse, a blackboard, some maps, probably some chalk. And they did that. So in 1852, I started with 6 boys who helped me actually clean the little schoolhouse. After 2 weeks, I had 55 students, and after a year, 100. And of course, at that point, the city realized the importance of having a public school. And by 1853, late in 1853, they had built an 8-room schoolhouse for public school students in Bordentown City. And of course, I was very proud of that.
That is just amazing. I'm so impressed that in this era where few women couldn't even vote, and it's just astounding to me that you took this upon yourself. You were so independent. You left your friends in Hightstown and went out on your own, and women weren't even expected to be out there in public, much less leading a campaign for public education. And women were expected generally to be silent helpmates to their husbands and mothers to their children, and or if they weren't married, to just be quiet old spinsters in the attic. And it's just remarkable to me that you found the courage to do that.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say that I did advocate for the right to vote. I was very good friends with Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists, and I also advocated for equal pay for women. I understand you're still working on that one, and of course, equal rights for African Americans. So I'm so glad that there has been some progress made in those areas. total progress. And I have to say that I was also very happy to see that my little schoolhouse has a brand new roof. Very happy to see that.
Yes, it's lovely that there were people who care about preserving the legacy of your schoolhouse and your educational legacy as an educational pioneer in New Jersey and in the United States. So Miss Barton or Clara, it must be exhausting to recall every detail of your public life. And I actually have spent some time in my life going over some of your accomplishments. So I was wondering if you would mind if I take it from here and then maybe you can interrupt me when I get it wrong.
Well, I'd be happy to have you take it from here, and I'm sure you're not going to get anything wrong. And my memory does sometimes it's been 199 years, so I am sometimes a little forgetful. So please go right ahead. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Clara. And thank you all for joining us today on this Sunday afternoon as we celebrate Clara Barton, her life and legacy. Now, I'm going to resume sharing my little slideshow here. I'm going to go through basically some of the greatest hits in the life of Clara Barton and some of her accomplishments and the challenges that she alluded to herself, which she overcame. Um, Now, I've been asked before, what made me interested in studying Clara Barton? And I actually came to Barton sort of by happenstance. I was originally interested in studying the American Red Cross and its role in disaster relief. And of course, anyone who's studied the American Red Cross or Clara Barton knows you can't get to the American Red Cross without coming across and studying Clara Barton first, right? There's no Red Cross without Clara Barton. And so what held my interest in Barton after I discovered that when I was at the National Archives and found, lo and behold, these beautiful handwritten volumes of Clara Barton that Clara Barton had written on early disaster relief. But what really held my interest was that Barton was so remarkable in her daring and her persistence and her what she did, her accomplishments as a woman who had no large inheritance. She was not part of the New York elite or one of the wealthiest families in America. And she did not have a wealthy husband. She was really on her own, and she persisted in really pursuing her humanitarian projects, and many times in the face of what seemed like overwhelming obstacles. And lastly, I think I really admire her for what I call her refusal to get old. And what I mean by this is that Barton, although she began teaching in her teens, really didn't start to make her mark publicly until her 30s, which really began at Bordentown with her educational pioneering. And her most notable accomplishment she achieved after age 40 and even after age 50. And this is in an era where life expectancy was around 40. Now, granted, a lot of that was so short because so many people died in infancy and childhood, but still, it's incredibly remarkable that Barton persisted well into her 80s to continue to innovate, to continue with her humanitarian enterprises, and to continue in spite of obstacles. And finally, I think what's inspiring about Barton is that she is someone who would see something wrong with the world around her, whether it was the little boys in Bordentown who had nowhere to go to school and were just loitering around, or whether it was people that she read about who were suffering overseas. And rather than just saying, oh, that's too bad, she would say, well, what can I do about it? And she would drop everything to actually build an organization to do something about it. So in this presentation, I'm going to discuss Barton's life and legacy with a focus on these major accomplishments and these challenges. And I'm going to really make the argument for why she deserves her place in the pantheon of notable and heroic figures in American history. Now, as many of you know, Barton was born in 1821 in the small town of North Oxford, Massachusetts. She founded the first, considered one of the first public schools in New Jersey in 1852. As Clara herself told us, that, you know, there were these what they called pauper schools, which were more institutions to contain and warehouse children than really educational institutions. And then she served as one of the first female patent clerks and one of the first female government workers. She aided wounded soldiers in the Civil War. She located over 20,000 missing soldiers after the war. Then, not content to rest on her laurels, she founded the American Red Cross in 1881, ran the organization for 23 years, and finally brought the first aid movement to the US in 1903. So where did Barton come from? Well, she spent her childhood in this modest home in North Oxford. She was the youngest by many years of Captain Stephen Barton, who actually had fought in the wars, the post-revolutionary campaigns in Michigan of the federal army, and they were fighting indigenous people. There's different views of that right now in terms of displacing indigenous people from their land. And he had fought in those, but at the time he was considered to be one of the leading citizens of North Oxford. And his wife was Sarah Stone Barton. And she was the youngest of 5 children by quite a bit. And she adored her father quite a bit, and she adored hearing his battle tales. And I think he was a role model for her, and her first sort of impressions about soldiers going to war and what they needed were formed really, you know, in connection with her father. Now, I hope with Clara being here, this is okay to say, she didn't always get along with her mother, who had a little bit of a temper. Her mother was actually a great believer in a science now discredited called phrenology, which is your head shape is actually supposed to be an indicator of your personality and aptitude. And, you know, there are many things wrong with phrenology. But the phrenologist actually analyzed Barton's head when she was young, and he proclaimed to her mother, she will never assert herself for herself, but for others, she will be perfectly fearless. Throw responsibility upon her. Now, of course, I don't believe in phrenology, but I do believe that the stories that influential people tell you about yourself when you're young often can help you shape your beliefs about yourself, right? And this I think was true for Clara. She heard this and she believed it. And she certainly would tell people later on about this. And I also believe in role models. And Barton had 3 elder siblings who were teachers. And finishing her schooling as a teenager, she worked in a textile mill for a little while, like many other young women in that area of Massachusetts, with the Lowell mills and other famous mills. But like her elder siblings, like 3 of her elder siblings, she became a teacher. And as any teacher knows, this is an enormous responsibility. This means you are responsible for, 15 to 20 young lives and for trying to keep order among all of these people. And she was smaller than some of the boys in her class, but she got in there and she played, these schoolyard sports with them. And she was patient yet firm, and she earned their trust. Now, after several years of teaching, as Clara herself told us, she went to Clinton Liberal Institute, which was actually an institute of the Universalist Church, which was later merged with the Unitarian Church. It was a very ecumenical church whose adherents believed that anyone could go to heaven and be saved, not just Christians, and that was considered to be a very radical belief. And that, I think, influenced her ecumenicism at the Red Cross later. As Clara told us, she met her friend Mary Norton from Hydetown, New Jersey, which is just up the turnpike from Bordentown, although they didn't have the turnpike then. And she came down to live in Bordentown and started the school in Bordentown. And I think another thing was that she was also looking for a next chapter in her life. She didn't want to go back to teach in North Oxford. She had few serious romantic prospects back home. I don't know, but I do not think she wanted to get married. I think she had a restless soul, and she wanted to have the freedom to basically go where she wanted to go and do what she wanted to do. And in those days, marriage was it had just been it was generally thought of as something that didn't, where women couldn't, once they got married, couldn't really make decisions about their life. They were bound to home and hearth and to taking care of children, and couldn't even choose how many children they wanted or whether they wanted to have children. So she chose to stay in Bordentown. And then after the school was so successful, the town decided that for the larger school, they needed a real superintendent, and they hired a man to run the school. And Barton was furious, and she became very depressed about it. But as I've said before, she didn't just stay depressed. She made a plan, and a friend of hers was going to Washington, D.C. to take a position, seeking a teaching position. And so she decided to take the train down to Washington with her friend, and to find a position as a governess. And the only person she knew was a distant cousin, Colonel Alexander DeWitt. And so she reasoned she could call upon the congressman, and maybe he could get her a position as a governess. And DeWitt was so impressed. Oh, this is the Bordentown schoolhouse. I forgot to show you. This is before the restoration in 1921. So this is the one-room schoolhouse in Bordentown where she began her work with 6 students and was so successful. And so Congressman DeWitt was so impressed with Barton's demeanor that he said, I'm not going to get you a job as a governess. There are openings at the patent office. And this was a classic political patronage job, but she had wonderful penmanship as a teacher. So she got a job at the patent office, which is pictured here in 1866, as one of the first female patent clerks. And this was not an easy job for many reasons. She had to copy patents longhand with a kind of pen that you dip into the ink well. And so, you can't make a mistake when you drop that ink. And not only that, when she'd walk down the hall, the male patent clerks, some of them weren't so crazy about having a woman working in the office. And so they would spit tobacco juice in her direction. But she was persistent in the face of this negative reaction. And she stayed in the patent office until 1856, the end of 1856, when a new administration came in, the Buchanan administration. And that was Buchanan and his cadre were DeWitt's political opponents. And as you probably remember in US history, the phrase "a new broom sweeps clean," there was a new cadre of patent clerks that were from from the Democratic Party. And so Barton left, and she went back to North Oxford to nurse her ailing father. But in 1860, there was a new administration again, President Lincoln. And when she came back, before even he was inaugurated, she came back to Washington in the end of 1860, and she resumed her work at the patent office. Now, when war broke out between the Southern secessionists and the Union in April 1861, this is when Barton began what I call her second humanitarian enterprise after Bordentown. And this began on April 19th, when the militias from Massachusetts and New York were traveling down to protect the national capital. They'd been called by President Lincoln. And when the Massachusetts militia was crossing Baltimore. They had to cross Baltimore to change trains. And they were crossing in a carriage. They were stopped by this mob of anti-war and Southern sympathizer civilians who were throwing bricks and paving stones at them. And they got out of their carriage and they marched, and they kept getting pummeled. And eventually the two sides end up exchanging gunfire, resulting in the deaths of 4 Massachusetts soldiers and 12 civilians, and many more people being injured, and the soldiers losing their kits, their packs. And they managed to get down to Washington, but they were in bad shape. They needed provisions. And at this time, Barton and other Washington women from Massachusetts went to go aid their Massachusetts militiamen and at the Capitol. And Barton discovered, she was walking around the Capitol, that she knew a couple of these young men because she taught them in Massachusetts. And I have to tell you that recent events really reminded me of this. I won't go into this much, but the events of January 6, 2021 and the aftermath, where you saw the National Guard encamped in the Capitol, were very reminiscent of what was going on in 1861 with the militias encamped in the Capitol to protect it. Certainly it reminded me of this episode, and I was looking to see a Clara Barton in a dark cape going around ministering to the National Guard troops. But alas, some things have changed. Now, as the war escalated, the number of wounded and dying men really became overwhelming. And this was something that was unforeseen. The medical supplies and medical staff were woefully insufficient to deal with this just massive carnage. And so Clara Barton and others gathered supplies, gathered food, gathered funds from people back home in Massachusetts. And she created this humanitarian venture where she was going out to provide aid and comfort to the wounded and sick troops. And she actually managed to wrangle a battlefield pass, which was very hard for a woman to do in those days, to travel to the site of some very bloody 1862 campaigns in Maryland and Virginia, including Antietam. And Barton's ambulance, many of you have probably seen it, is in the Smithsonian National Museum of American History. Now, I have to say that this is not Barton's most unique work. If Barton had just stopped here, she might be a small paragraph, even a footnote in history. There are many other women who were aiding the Union soldiers at this time, some aiding Confederate soldiers. There's one woman named Mother Bickerdike, and who was aiding a lot of Union soldiers, who was very famous. But she's forgotten. Dorothea Dix was famous for many things, but she also was responsible for the nurse corps in the Union Army. But what distinguished Barton, if she did this and so many others? Well, after the war, as Barton herself mentioned, she launched a campaign to find missing soldiers. And this was at the behest of families who were writing her and saying, my son hasn't come home. I've heard nothing from the Union Army, which was incredibly disorganized at the time. And so she wanted a personal campaign to go and find them. She went down to Andersonville in Georgia, which had been a horrific and unsanitary prison camp. And importantly, while she was there, she not only located this roll of prisoners at the camp, which helped her to find out the whereabouts of many missing soldiers, but she also encountered and met many formerly enslaved people. And some of them actually were still actually being enslaved, even though the war was over, and didn't know that they had been freed. And she helped several people get to Washington, get positions, and get out of there. And there was one woman who had been whipped and who had scars from being whipped. And when Barton came back to Washington, she testified before the Committee on Reconstruction in Congress. And she was the only woman to testify before this committee. And she testified to these horrors that she had seen. And Barton was a vivid storyteller. And if there's any reason why she stood out, it's among all these Civil War volunteers, besides continuing her work after the war, it was because she was able to tell these dramatic tales about the war itself. And she was invited to go on a lecture tour after the Civil War, and to give these lectures to these audiences of Union soldiers, of now Union veterans. And she toured the Eastern and Midwestern states, and really became somewhat famous, sort of in the manner that Mark Twain did at the time, for these dramatic and compelling lectures. And they were so dramatic, and she had worked herself so hard during the war, and even then after the war, and then during these speaking campaigns, that one day in 1868, she was speaking and she lost her voice. And it wasn't just temporary. She completely collapsed. And she suffered what she called a nervous collapse, and she was bedridden. And she was probably physically and emotionally and psychologically exhausted, as anyone would be after all the work she did. And so her doctor recommended something, a prescription that I certainly would like to get from a doctor someday. He recommended that she go to Switzerland to recuperate. And by this time, even though she had not inherited a fortune, she had money from from her work as a patent clerk, and she was incredibly thrifty. And she had money that she'd gotten in recompense for all of her missing soldiers work, and she had money from the speaking tours. And so she had enough money to go to Switzerland and spend some time recuperating and then touring around. And so this trip to Switzerland was fortuitous. And so in mid-1869, she boarded a steamer and headed to Switzerland via London and Paris. And she stayed along the banks of Lake Geneva with a family of a young man named Jules Gollet. He was a Swiss volunteer for the Union. So it wasn't just Americans who were volunteering. There were others who came and helped out. And she had actually cared for him when he was wounded. So the family really wanted to thank her. Now, even though she loved the beautiful banks of Lake Geneva, who wouldn't, she did complain that it was quite chilly, that Swiss homes weren't quite as well heated as American homes were. And during this period, she had this social encounter that would prove transformative for the rest of her life, and really up until the present. And this was a visit from Dr. Louis Appia, who is one of the founders of the fledgling Red Cross movement based in Geneva. And this was called the International Committee of the Red Cross. And Dr. Appia, along with a lawyer named Gustave Monnier and a Swiss general, Dufour, who was kind of this gruff Swiss general, but very famous, and a Genevan doctor named Théodore Monnois, they had embraced the ideals of this visionary entrepreneur named Henri Dunant, or Henry Dunant, as we call. And so who was Dunant? These are the 5 founders of the International Committee of the Red Cross: Appia, Dunant, Monnier, Dufour, and Monnois. So who was Dunant? Well, Dunant was an entrepreneur. He had been visiting this Italian town, well, it was a contested town in northern Italy now, in 1859. And the reason he'd been there was not to be involved in the war that was taking place there. He was trying to get an audience with Emperor Napoleon III, Napoleon III. And it was about a business matter. And frankly, Dunant was a colonialist. He wanted to engage in a colonial business venture in Algeria, and he wanted water rights from Napoleon III. So Dunant himself had multiple sides, being both a colonialist and a humanitarianism. He was complex. And he found himself in the middle of this awful and bloody battle, which is pictured dramatically here. But who was fighting was not the important part. The political side wasn't. It was the weapons they were using. These newly more accurate rifles that fired these bullets called mini balls. And these bullets would rip apart the flesh on people's faces and on people's body in really gruesome ways when they hit. And the weaponry had advanced, but the medical corps and the medical aid had not caught up with it. And so the armies were just leaving most of the wounded soldiers on the field to languish and die. And so do not help the local townspeople set up a makeshift hospital for wounded men in a church. This is a very well-known story in the annals of the Red Cross movement. And the other thing that he did, just like Barton, he didn't just volunteer to aid. He was also someone who promoted his ideas and who was a good writer and a very dramatic writer. And so he wrote this book, Un Souvenir de Solferino, a memoir of Solferino, where he graphically described the horrors of this battlefield. And he proposed this movement. And he said, what if the nations of the world, starting with the European nations, which he believed were the most civilized with his colonialist view, what if they set up volunteer aid societies to aid all the wounded, that would aid the wounded on all sides in time of war, and that members of these societies would be off limits in the battle. And this would limit the carnage of war. Now, this idea is very interesting because it's not that idealistic. He's not saying we've got to get rid of war altogether, as some of us might if we saw a battle like this. He's saying war is inevitable. This is the time of the rise of the nation state and the rise of colonialism. He says, what we need to do is try, before we can eliminate war altogether, we need to limit its negative consequences. Now, his book was widely read in influential circles, and these circles included Appia, Mounier, and Mounoir and Dufour, these Geneva businessmen, and they met in February 1863 with Dunant to discuss how they could put this idea into action. And then in October 1863, held this first conference of Geneva, where they began to draft what became the first Geneva Convention. And then they met again in 1864 with representatives from many nations around Europe, and representatives of 11 countries signed this, which bound them to treat enemy combatants humanely once the battle was over, to set up these medical volunteer aid societies. And the medical volunteers were to identify themselves by these white armbands with the Red Cross on them. And I'll tell you a little bit later, this was not a religious designation. It was really the reverse of the Swiss flag, and it was which was already then seen as a symbol of neutrality. And in fact, the signatories all adopted this. They were all happy. But then Turkey became interested, and Turkey said, well, we can't accept this cross, because the cross to us represents the crusaders who came in and, tried to convert and maraud and kill, et cetera. So how about we have a red crescent, which is more, represents our culture. And to their credit, the founders of the International Committee of the Red Cross acceded to that and said yes. And so then it became the International Red Cross and Red Crescent movement. And this also opened the way for other non-Christian countries such as Japan to join. And later on, for example, Israel was able to join, and there was a long fight over it, but they have a diamond as the red diamond as the symbol. But where was the US? Well, this is 1864. So the US is not involved. The US has other things going on. In fact, trying to preserve the Union. The US sent a representative to talk about the wonderful things we were doing with the US Sanitary Commission, but did not get involved in signing. And so there was some sort of moribund Red Cross society in New York at the time, by the end of the 1860s. But when Louis Appia visited Clara Barton in Geneva, he thought this is our chance to really get an American Red Cross off the ground. He'd heard about her already. Her reputation across the Atlantic. And then the next year, the Franco-Prussian War broke out. And so Barton was able to go and observe what the Swiss Red Cross and the British Red Cross and these other organizations were doing in near the battlefield. Now, she couldn't get onto the battlefield because she had two things against her. She was a woman, which in Europe, you couldn't get onto the battlefield as a woman, and she was a foreigner. But she was persistent, and she managed to befriend this Grand Duchess of Baden, who provided her with funds to aid civilians in Strasbourg. And by doing this, she extended the concept of the Red Cross as including aid to civilians. And so after this, she thought, this Red Cross movement is really an improvement on some of the haphazard relief we had in the Civil War. And she committed to the founders of the ICRC that when she went back to the United States, she would found an American Red Cross. Now, she returned to the US in 1873. Her sister was dying. Her sister soon passed away, and Clara fell into a depression. And she was immobilized. She called herself an invalid. But then she read about this cure, rest cure, and what we'd call a health food cure in Dansville, New York. And she moved to Dansville, and she started eating all of this healthy food, and it was a healthy kind of environment, and she recovered. And in 1877, she was well enough, and there were these embers of conflict that were flaring up in Europe again that sort of brought it to mind. She thought, I've got to go fulfill my promise, and I'm going to go get the US to sign on to the Treaty of Geneva so we can get going with an American Red Cross. So she went back to Washington, and that's the Grand Duchess of Baden, that's her friend. And she went back to Washington to try to take this idea to President Rutherford B. Hayes. And she was rebuffed. The Americans didn't want to get involved in some European idea. They regarded these European nations as anti-democratic, as decadent, politically backward aristocracies. And the other thing was that the US did not consider itself a military power, and the Red Cross idea was about war and militaries. And if you think about that, that's kind of remarkable. So in 1870, the population of the US was about 38 million, and we had about 37,200 in the military. By 1890, it had gone up to 62 million, and we had actually fewer people in the military. So we were actually demilitarizing during this period, 1870 to 1890, except in the West, where there were conflicts going on and Native peoples were being displaced from their lands. But overall, the country was demilitarizing during this time. And this is, compared to now, it's drastically different. So the population is 331 million. We have 1.35 million active duty. If you look at, our population has grown by a factor of more than 5. Our growth in the military has been almost 50 times. And so proportionately, it's been almost a 10-fold growth. And you'd say almost a 15-fold growth if you count the Guard and the Reserve. So this was a real hard sell for Barton back then. And the Civil War had killed what we know is up to 750,000 people. And many people just wanted to put their lives back together. They didn't want to think about joining some volunteer auxiliary from some war that they hoped would never happen. But at the time, the country was becoming geographically unified through the transcontinental railroad system. And we were building major industrial capacity, major urbanization was taking place, and the agricultural capacity of the West was increasing. And these changes, this huge transition, caused a lot of havoc. Urbanization and crowding produced cholera epidemics in major cities from New York to Philadelphia to Baltimore in the 1850s and 60s. You had the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871. The expansion of farming led to these grasshopper plagues in the Great Plains, and the expansion of rail networks led to these awful train accidents that increased year by year. And so Barton was really innovative. She said, how about this American Red Cross deal with American problems? And how about we deal with what she called national calamities, floods, earthquakes, epidemics, fires, and storms. And another innovation is that she said we would adapt these ideas of humanity and neutrality, which were implicit in the Geneva Convention, and that we would adapt them to domestic uses. And she reimagined this in this American way to be neutrality at the intersection of these conflicts around gender, around racism, et cetera, around ethnicity. And she said, the American Red Cross must be free from all shadows of sex or race and must give to the Muslim, the Israelite, and the heathen the same consideration it accords to the Christian. Now, this is actually, in my view, anything but a neutral stance. I think she really couldn't help but be an advocate on behalf of egalitarianism, egalitarian assistance in disasters and other conflicts, just as she took a stand in favor of egalitarian education for the children of New Jersey. And if you consider the time, this was a time in the South where Reconstruction was ending and incredible violence toward African Americans, incredible levels was transpiring. There were incredible levels of violence, and she was saying, we have to treat everyone equally, and so that was kind of a radical notion. And so it took her a while, but through her dogged persistence and really harassing the War Secretary of War under Garfield, Robert Lincoln, and eventually then once Chester Arthur was in office, once Garfield was assassinated, continuing with this, that she got the US to sign on to the Geneva Convention. Now, what happened with her American Red Cross? How then she got the US to sign on the Geneva Convention, but founding an organization was another thing, because the US government wasn't really supporting her in this, just as many other governments that were monarchies had support from the monarchy or the nobility. And so she really had to do this on her own. And she had a couple of small scale successes with a Mississippi flood and with a Michigan storm in the early 1880s. But then in 1888, she really had a major debacle at Jacksonville, Florida. And what happened was Barton wanted to go to aid the victims of a yellow fever epidemic. And the thing is, she wasn't immune, and it's a deadly disease even now. And so she had to find someone else to go. And so she found this one-armed Confederate colonel from New Orleans who was immune and had a corps of nurses. And he supervised the nurses, but he didn't do a good job. And suddenly she found that her Red Cross was splayed across the headlines of the New York newspapers, with the headlines like "Some nurses get drunk," and insubordination on the part of the Red Cross nurses. One of the nurses was under arrest. And she was deeply embarrassed by this. And this debacle led Barton to really pull back and not delegate. And I think that limited her ability to really grow the American Red Cross. Now, moving forward quickly in the time we have allotted, because I can go on and on and on about this, but the Johnstown flood was for her really a redemption. This is the Johnstown, this lake at Johnstown, man-made lake, and the dam broke, and it sent millions of gallons of water heading downriver to destroy the town of Johnstown. And Barton came in really supplementing the work of the local flood relief committee and only providing about $39,000 worth of aid. But the supplementary work she did was important. She provided emergency aid before this state organized relief committee could do its work, its long-term work. And she also provided aid that was sensitive to the needs of women who were there. So they were household managers, and she gave people the items they needed to set up a household. And she also, her Red Cross team addressed the psychological dimensions of the problem, the kind of what she called nervous prostration that people were suffering from. And she actively engaged the women of Johnstown as agents in their own relief. And so at the end of this period, the people of Johnstown were very grateful to her. And they said, she has indeed been an elder sister to us, nursing, soothing, tending, caring for the stricken ones through a season of distress such as no other people ever knew. And Barton was there for a good 9 months herself on the ground, leading this relief operation. And this gained her even more renown because she was, the flood itself was a huge news story, and she became a news story as well, and her Red Cross gained from that. Now, 3 years later, or actually 4 years later, another huge disaster transpired, a hurricane that hit the Sea Islands that are in South Carolina and in the northern end of Georgia. And this is a boat you see here that's been washed up ashore. And it was devastating to the local Gula people of the Sea Islands. And Barton went down there and she found incredible distress. She said, this is a harder field than Johnstown. It's an archipelago of islands. There are more people to care for, more destitute and helpless, spread over hundreds of square miles of territory. And there, you know, it was malarial, there was fever. And the other thing is there was a lot less sympathy among the public for the people who had suffered. And it was partly due to their region, but it was also due to their race. And the Johnstown flood was on the front page of the New York World for 10 days, for example. The Sea Island storm was on the front page for 3 days, but if you look at the columns, the total number of columns, it was much, much less. And there also was a newspaper fundraising drive. So a lot of the funds raised for disaster survivors were raised through newspapers back then, and they would be funneled to the Red Cross. And the newspapers really didn't see their readers being so interested in these people in the Sea Islands. And so they only launched a drive 52 days later when there was a yellow fever epidemic in Georgia. And that really this unequal coverage and unequal support, largely based on the race of the people, really hampered Barton's effort. Nonetheless, she stuck it out with her group of people. She engaged the people of the Sea Islands in committees to plant a crop and to get themselves back on their feet. And she also endured criticism for focusing on the people of the Sea Islands and not the people who are largely white, who are from the mainland, who've been actually less affected. And the local press there really attacked her for that. So in here you see her vision of what she called neutrality, which I would say is social egalitarianism, came under fire, and she persisted with that. I'm going to jump through a couple more of her greatest hits and then wrap up here. But she went to Armenia to aid the people, the suffering Armenians who'd been attacked by Kurds and other groups in between 1894 and 96. This was a political, these were massacres that were the forerunners of the Armenian genocide. And she was able to convince the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire to let her in because she had this cloak of neutrality and she wasn't representing Christian groups, even though she took money from Christian American groups. She said, I'm representing this neutral organization, and she was able to get aid to the survivors of these massacres who'd been displaced. The next year, she went to Cuba, or in 1897, after the Spanish were removing Cuban people in the countryside from their land, and what they called them reconcentrados, concentrating them in these just encampments that were surrounded by barbed wire. And of course, the people were starving. They didn't give them much food, and they were taken from their land. And so she went to go aid the reconcentrados. And in doing so, actually, she did this actually after the local paper had actually reported her to be seriously ill. She's 77 years old, and they're saying she's extremely feeble, and her advanced age is said to be against the speedy recovery. Her physicians say she may engage in no Red Cross work for the remainder of the winter, but she bounced back, and she ended up going to Cuba and drawing a lot of attention to the plight of the Cubans. And this is her nephew, Stephen Barton, who is the head of the Central Cuban Relief Committee and marshaled aid from many different organizations. And this is just some of what she saw. There were children who were emaciated, were starving, for mere skeletons. And this, I don't think she wanted this to happen, but this sort of site ended up marshaling the US to be supporting the war, and that together with the sinking of the Maine in Havana Harbor. Now, Barton tried to go to Cuba by the time when the war was going on to help the American troops. She was barred by the blockade, and there was a lot of wastage of a lot of aid that had been raised for the American Red Cross, and a lot of disorganization. And this continued in 1900 when the Galveston hurricane flattened Galveston, Texas, killed at least 7,000 people. And by this time, the Spanish-American War had caused Congress to notice the Red Cross, to federally charter it, and as a condition of the charter, to require an annual report. And this is actually what led to Barton's ouster. One of Barton's assistants said, we're obliged to give a full report and itemized account to Congress on the 1st of January. It's vital to us that these matters should be kept in business-like shape. And Barton was an entrepreneur, and she was a passionate on-the-ground advocate. She was involved, and she rolled up her sleeves and got them dirty, but she was not at all an accountant, and she did not keep the books well. And so this left her vulnerable to criticism at this time. And this is her in 1904. This is Mabel Boardman, who was a Washington, D.C. socialite, who became involved in auditing the Red Cross as a volunteer effort, and then really turned on Barton and accused her of embezzling Red Cross funds, which wasn't true. She just didn't keep a great accounting of them, and basically got her ousted from the Red Cross. And this is Henri Dunant, coming back to him. So he actually ended up homeless. He ended up kicked out of a lot of his businesses, a total business failure, which was considered incredibly humiliating for a Swiss businessman. And he was actually rediscovered in some, that equivalent of a homeless shelter in 1901 and given the Nobel Prize. And Barton never really had this kind of honor during her lifetime. She did not live to see her reputation rehabilitated. And yet, even after being ousted from the Red Cross, she persisted in humanitarian enterprises. She founded this National First Aid Association of America in 1903 and brought the idea of first aid in industrial accidents to the US from Great Britain. And that eventually was taken over by the American Red Cross. And so I wish that she were alive to know, and now I guess I see her at 199, to be able to live to see how her legacy has flourished and how much she is appreciated for all of these humanitarian enterprises that she seeded and began, and that are continue to flourish and continue to help people to this day. And lastly, I would just ask you to, this has been a program of the Bordentown Historical Society, and where the Clara Barton Schoolhouse is. And so if you want to know more, you can go to bordentownhistory.org, and you can donate to them. And I'd encourage you to donate to your local history society. And I just want to thank Stephen and Bonnie and Clara for joining me today. And thank you all as well.
Ron, you want to go on?
Well, there's some chat, there's some questions. Do you want to look at the questions of the chat room before I say a few other words? I see 3 Q&As. Can you?
Okay, let me see.
Marion, do you need to?
I will see if I can see the Q&As. Doesn't look like I can see them. Where are they? Maybe if I stop sharing.
Or
Okay.
the chat?
Okay, Q&A. I can see them.
I just have 3 Q&As here.
Okay, maybe you can tell me them because I don't seem to be able to see them.
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you, Marion, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so Barbara asks, how long did Clara teach in Bordentown, and what is there to see at the schoolhouse today?
Mm.
Can you go in or just look at the outside?
Well,
Okay, well, maybe Clara can answer that herself.
yes, I can answer that. So Clara was there a little less than 2 years because it was late 1853 when they had completed the 8-room schoolhouse and hired the man to be principal. And that's when she was very upset and depressed, as we've heard, and left and went to Washington. But right now, although we're still in the process of restoring the schoolhouse, and we're actually going to restore it to the way it was in 1921, 100 years ago. And I will say that it's a very cute story because in 1921, you saw the picture, the very sad looking picture of the schoolhouse. So once the school was built in 1853, the schoolhouse was really abandoned. And it was it was about to be sold at a sheriff's sale. And a wealthy man from Bordentown bought it for $300 so that it wouldn't be destroyed. And then it was given to the state commissioner of education for $1. And in any event, what the commissioner of education did was ask all of the school children of the state of New Jersey if they would donate not more than a penny, and the teachers to donate not more than a nickel to restore the Clara Barton schoolhouse. So in our efforts today to restore the schoolhouse, we are going to restore it to the way it was restored in 1921. Right now, the schoolhouse has been closed because of COVID concerns. And really for a very long time, it's been available by appointment only. It's hard to have enough volunteers to be there on a regular basis. And the biggest problem is there's no bathroom there, so we can't be there for a really long time. But you can contact the Historical Society, and I will be happy to show anyone the schoolhouse. It's filled with, some interesting things, some old books and things that you might have seen at that time, and also some really great pictures of Clara Barton and places where she's lived. So we welcome people to come. You just need to contact us so that we can schedule a special, appointment for you.
Okay, Claudia asks, when was Barton eventually recognized for her work?
Well, her supporters continued to try to promote her legacy. It was about 1930 when there was at the American Red Cross headquarters in Washington, which had been built after her death, a statue was erected to Barton. And Mabel Boardman actually opposed this statue, did not want it there at all. But by this time, I think many in the American Red Cross had recognized Barton's legacy. And so it began to come back around where Barton started to be recognized as a very important in the American Red Cross. And since then, I think Barton has shared, and sometimes with Boardman, and sometimes has a greater spotlight in terms of her role in the American Red Cross. And then in terms of the Civil War, I think I don't consider myself a specialist on Civil War history, but I think as Civil War history and American history began to shift from just battlefield history, who won what and what munitions were used, and started to look at the social and human history, I think Clara Barton definitely came back into focus. And she's for a long time, maybe since the 1930s, and even in the post World War II period, been a popular character among children's literature. There have been several wonderful books written about her for young people. And I think in many ways, it's the young people of our country who have carried her legacy forward even more than those of us who are adults, because they see what an incredible story she has and all of the courageous things that she did.
I will say that I found an article indicating that in March of 2019, the patent office, patent and trademark office, where she worked as presumably the first female full-time employee of the federal government, they named their public space in honor of Clara Barton.
Mhm.
And so I thought that was very interesting. And I did send them an email to let them know that we were talking about Clara Barton today. So if there's anybody there from the patent office, thanks for coming.
Yes. And also, I have to say, Richard Lyons from the General Services Administration is a real hero in that he discovered the missing soldiers office, which was going to be slated for demolition. And he discovered important papers that were there and really led to what is now the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Museum, which is in downtown DC, and it's not far from the patent office. And so I think that's important. That was 1997, and there's a Civil War to Civil Rights trail, and Clara Barton, there's a plaque of Clara Barton on that as well that you can see.
Okay.
Steve,
So Louisa asks, so the current mascot for the Clara Barton School is the bulldog. Would it be more appropriate for it to be a cat?
Absolutely. In her home in Glen Echo, which is a National Historic Site, it's now again been closed to COVID, but there's a portrait of one of her cats. So she's the kind of person who had a cat's portrait made. That's how much she cared about cats. So that would be a wonderful thing.
and she was an animal lover. She was quite the equestrian. She was an animal lover and a vegetarian for most of her life because of her love of animals.
Yes. So it could be some kind of horse, like a Mustang. That could be a good animal mascot.
And if the question came from the principal of the Clara Barton Elementary School, Louisa, I think we should just get a horse and put it right out there, eating your grass, and you will not need a lawnmower. And I'll help take care of it.
Okay, and Pamela asks, where was the schoolhouse near Heightstown where Clara Barton taught? I don't think she taught in Heightstown.
No.
She
So
taught
that
she taught in a school outside of Heightstown for a period of time when she was living with the Nortons, but I don't recall exactly where it was.
They may not be there anymore either. And she had taught in North Oxford for a long time as well. And I don't think those schoolhouses are around, although there's a Clara Barton Birthplace Museum that would be a place to go if you're interested in her childhood.
Okay, so I think I don't see any more. Hang on.
It says 10 Q&As on
Yeah.
Okay,
my
okay,
computer.
I was at the comments. Oh, no, this is Q&As. I'm at the Q&As. So there are a couple of thank yous. So I do not see any more questions unless I'm missing something.
Oh, I see one in the chat. Oh, for Clara Barton's story during the Civil War, Stephen Oates, Women of Valor. Absolutely. That's a really good book for just if you're interested in all of her work during the Civil War. Oh, and someone said she taught on Imlaystown Road in Heightstown. Someone asked, how much was she involved with the suffrage movement? So, as some of you may know, Susan B. Anthony lived in Washington, D.C., and Washington City, as they called it. Clara lived there. They didn't live that far from one another, and they sometimes were invited to the same events where illustrious women would be invited, and they became friends. And Barton supported suffrage. She actually, for when James Garfield, who was an old Civil War general, was running, she campaigned for Garfield. So she used her voice, even though she couldn't use her vote. And she went to show up to vote for Garfield. Now she was turned away, but that actually was a news story. So she did a one-person demonstration. She was not someone who was attending all the suffrage conventions and active because she felt that her work was with the Red Cross and not, she only had so many hours in the day, but she was certainly outspoken for women's rights and for suffrage.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. Bon, do you?
Well, on my screen, it says 12 under Q&A, but
In the Q&A, when you click on that, that was.
now it says 13. I don't know.
Some are just comments.
Okay.
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 Oh, someone says there's a booklet called Clara Barton in Heightstown by Grace Norton Rogers. I actually thought I knew all the Clara Barton literature. I don't know that one. So great. All right.
Yeah. And I guess people, I don't know, at some point, I think people could only see one of us at a time. I hope that's been corrected. Well, in any event, first of all, the gig is up. I am not Clara Barton. I am Bonnie Goldman, the co-president of the Bordentown Historical Society. First, I have to thank Dr. Moser-Jones, Marion, for your wonderful presentation. Clearly, you're so knowledgeable about Clara Barton and the Red Cross, and it was just so interesting. And thank you so much for supporting the Bordentown Historical Society and joining us for this. And I thank everybody who's there, at least looks like 56 people. Thank you all for joining us. I hope that you've enjoyed the presentation. You certainly can contact us through Bordentown Historical Society at gmail.com. Bordentownhistory.org is our website. There are a few people who I think said they had trouble getting in, and this has been recorded, and we'll certainly try to contact those folks. I'm sorry if we lost a few people in some way. We're still fundraising for the Clara Barton Schoolhouse. We have major things to do, electrical and things like HVAC and this and that. So we are still looking for donations for the schoolhouse. And we're very, very busy this year celebrating Clara Barton's 200th birthday, planting 6 trees at the Clara Barton Elementary School in honor of her first 6 students who you heard about, and doing some other things for which we will need some sponsors. So if you look on our website or on our Facebook page, we may be asking for some help with some of the things that we're doing, and we'll appreciate any support you can give us in that regard. So thank you all, and especially Marion, since you called me Clara, I'm hoping I can call you Marion. Yes. But it was just so enjoyable, and we really loved having you here.
Marion, do we have time for 3 more questions?
Yes, we do. And I just wanted to say thanks again, Bonnie and Stephen, and all of you who are obviously joining me in the Clara Barton Appreciation Society. So yes, 3 more questions.
Okay, so Connie asks, I wanted to ask whether Clara knew anything about the school for Black children that was established a decade before her school in Bordentown.
That's a good question. So it was established in Bordentown. That's a good question. I don't know. I do not know that.
I don't either. And I don't remember reading anything about that, as a matter of fact. I don't remember reading anything about that. I mean, obviously, I mean, we know that Clara Barton uh, was not only an advocate for equal rights for women, but for African Americans. But I don't remember reading anything about that. We'll have to see. We'll have to look into it to see if we can find anything to help answer that question.
Okay, and Peter asks, have you heard about the Clara Barton documents and letters being sold by the Robb collection? All you need is a spare $200,000 to purchase them.
Oh, well,
Oh. Well, I do not have those. I'm not sure which one, which ones they are. I would be interested in that. So it says one of the attendees says school number 2 was established as an all-black student elementary school before Clara Barton school, and that's really interesting. So I do want to say Barton really became engaged more in advocacy with and on behalf of African Americans during the Civil War. Well, immediately prior. So, she became friends with John Brown's family, and I think when it was John Brown's sister or something like that. So she became incredibly passionate on behalf of the Union and abolitionism. And then really during the Civil War, she was down in South Carolina. And that's when she actually her first trip to South Carolina was during the Civil War, and she in Port Royal, which was also in the Low Country, and she met a lot of folks who were down there involved in education for the freedmen and the children of freedmen who were in the Low Country, who'd fled from the South Carolina plantations and were setting up their own farms and independent lives. And she and Fanny Gage, who was a mentor of hers and an abolitionist, set up a school, and Fanny had set up a school, but she was involved in teaching the children of the freedmen and women to read. And I think that Bordentown probably predated a lot of Barton's awakening about the extent of racial injustice and the extent of the racial the need for education for Black children. But it's interesting that there was a parallel movement going on for educating Black children in Bordentown, New Jersey, even at the time that Barton was working with the white children in Bordentown.
Okay, and then Cindy, and this is a really good question. There was mention of, Cindy asked, there was mention of her bouts with depression. Could it have been that she suffered from PTSD after seeing so much by way of war and disasters?
I think certainly, but I think before her bouts with depression preceded that. In fact, she became depressed after the city of Bordentown, hired the male superintendent or the male leader for the school, and that was before the Civil War, before any of this. So I think she did. Some people are biologically prone to depression, and as a result of perhaps childhood conflicts and things like that. So it was probably both. I mean, and I also think we tend to diagnose people posthumously in light of our own understandings of disease. And she was also probably incredibly physically exhausted by some of the things she did. So, which can go hand in hand and produce depressive symptoms as well.
She was depressed when she was living in Heightstown. She kept a diary, and I read some entries from her diary. So she had depression issues before she even started teaching in Bordentown. So like you say, it wasn't just after she lost the position of the principal's, the principal's position after founding the school that she had depression. She was depressed even before that. And really, to think about the bouts of depression and ill health that she had, when you look at her life in its entirety, and to imagine even back at in those times that she traveled, to Europe, to Russia, to Cuba, to Johnstown at times when it was so much more challenging to travel,
Yes.
and she didn't have Eddie Bauer clothes to wear. She's probably wearing this hat.
Oh, yeah, and her boots. Those boots do not look comfortable. I know, yes. Oh, someone here says that they're descended from her grandfather Barton, and that we all still have problems with depression. It's a familiar problem, although we all have been active in the Red Cross for generations. So again, it speaks to the fact that, I think one maybe a posthumous accomplishment of Barton can be that as someone who is a role model for someone who can have the illness of depression throughout their lives and persist and still contribute amazing things to the world. I mean, she's, even if she hadn't had depression, her accomplishments would be exemplary. So I appreciate that. I actually found that I have a family connection to Clara Barton, and I found this after I wrote my book. My great grandfather on my mother's side was in the Massachusetts 57th Volunteers, which was one of the later regiments mustered. And that the Massachusetts 57th was headed by George Barton, Clara's cousin. And so really, my great-great-grandfather, the way Clara thought of the Massachusetts militia was they were her boys. And so my great-great-grandfather was one of her boys. And I like to think that maybe he met her, when she was on the battlefield sometime. He was at Fredericksburg, basically manning the battlements and trying to keep the secessionists from coming up to Washington in 1864 and 65. So I found that out later, and I thought that is so strange because I didn't know that when I wrote the book.
So Mike Skelly wrote a comment. The old Clara Barton schoolhouse was the first publicly funded public school in Bordentown. That school admitted Black and white children, poor and rich. The 8-room school was next. School number 2 was established when schools became segregated. And I think that was a very good comment.
Well,
and
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, school segregation is really well, it'd be interesting to research that more, frankly. But racial segregation of schools flowed from and accompanied Plessy v. Ferguson and the move to segregate society by race in the late 19th century. So that doesn't surprise me. But it would be interesting to find out more about school number 2 nonetheless.
And then Jim Marini asked, where did Clara Barton live when she was in Bordentown?
I think Clara told us she lived in a boarding house, right, Clara?
Lived in a boarding house, and I know that our Vice President Doug, he at some point told me exactly where it was or who she lived with, but that I don't recall. But she did live in a boarding house.
And I think with another teacher, she had a friend who was also a teacher and who also lived in the boarding house. It was just, a group that back then there weren't the kind of apartment buildings it was that we have now. It would be someone who cooked the meals and everyone ate around a common table, and probably a nice place, but pretty rudimentary.
Well, she was in a boarding house when she was in Washington.
Yeah,
in what has become the museum, the Missing Soldiers Museum.
yes. And her landlady, her original boarding house, her landlady was a woman named Elmira Fales, who was from South Danvers, Massachusetts. And Elmira is the one who got Clara involved in going to the Capitol to help the militias. So yes, and it says here, boarding house is the same building as the newspaper, now Boyd's Pharmacy. So yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Michael.
Any other questions?
I think we're good.
Well, once again, thanks to you, Marion, and thanks to everyone who's joined us. I just think it was a wonderful afternoon, and we'll look forward. I will say we are going to have another lecture, the Bordentown Historical Society, in May about Clara Barton in her own words, and some others throughout the rest of the year. So just take a look at our website and Facebook to stay on top of our events. And thank you so much.
And just there's one more thank you, Marion, that I think is very appropriate. Thank you on behalf of the Clara Barton Chapter, National Society, Daughters of the Union, 1861-1865, Summers Point, New Jersey, Rosemary Wallace, Regent. So
Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you. Daughters of the Union. Excellent. All right.
thank you very much. This
Thank
was a
you.
wonderful presentation, Marion.
Thank you.
so
Thank you, Clara.
much.
Thanks,
Thanks.
Clara.
Thanks.
Thanks to everyone.
Thanks. Okay.